The infant's wail pierced the dawn, quiet like a blade slicing through skin. Ezekiel Thorne abandoned his spade and sprinted toward the railway line, his pulse pounding in his chest. What he discovered there would demolish all his assumptions. About his spouse's passing, a small bundle wrapped in ragged cloth rested beside the iron rails, no older than several months. The child's cries rang out over the barren grassland, raw and desperate. But when Ezekiel crouched and gently picked up the infant, his blood froze solid. Around the baby's throat hung a delicate silver pendant identical to the one he'd entombed with his cherished Margaret 3 years prior. His fingers quivered. As he drew the child nearer, the pendant was unmistakable. He'd purchased it for Margaret on their wedding day, having it inscribed with their initials woven together like ivy. He'd given it one final kiss before placing it upon her breast in the casket. Yet here it was, warm against this unknown child's skin, reflecting the dawn light as it had done countless mornings on Margaret's neck. The infant ceased crying and gazed up at him with eyes the shade of storm clouds. Ezekiel's thoughts raced through unthinkable possibilities. Grave robbers. But Margaret's burial place showed no evidence of disturbance when he'd visited the previous month. A vicious prank. But who in this forsaken territory even knew the pendant existed? He scanned the horizon, searching for whoever might have abandoned this child. The grassland extended infinitely in every direction, interrupted only by his humble ranch dwelling and the gleaming tracks that vanished into the morning mist. Not a living soul, visible not even smoke from a distant campfire. The baby's tiny fingers curled around his thumb. And Ezekiel felt something fracture within his chest. This child required nourishment, warmth, shelter, but the questions seared his throat like venom. How did this infant acquire Margaret's pendant? Where did she originate? And why did peering into those gray eyes feel like gazing into a reflection of his own shame? He rose slowly, cradling the infant against his chest. The wind strengthened, carrying the scent of approaching rain and something else, something that made his flesh crawl with dread. As he turned toward his ranch house, a slip of paper fluttered from the baby's blanket and settled at his feet. Ezekiel bent down and retrieved it. Written in unsteady handwriting were 4 words that made his universe shift. She knows the truth. But as he stared at those words, wondering who she could possibly be, he failed to notice the figure observing him from the ridge above his properties. Someone who had been waiting for this moment for 3 long years. Ezekiel burst through his front entrance, the baby still wailing in his arms. His mind couldn't grasp what he'd just read. She knows the truth. What truth? Margaret had perished from fever during that harsh winter when the physician couldn't reach them through the snow. He'd held her hand as she faded away, whispering promises he'd never been able to fulfill. But uncertainty crept in like morning mist. The baby needed immediate care, so he set the questions aside and focused on what he could manage. He found an old wooden box and lined it with quilts, creating a makeshift cradle near the hearth. The child's cries softened as warmth filled the room. Ezekiel heated milk from his goats and carefully fed the baby using a clean cloth, watching those strange gray eyes examine his face with disturbing intelligence. As the infant settled into slumber, he pulled the pendant free and studied it under the lamplight. Every mark, every tiny dent was precisely as he remembered. This wasn't some copy. This was Margaret's pendant. The paper felt coarse between his fingers as he read those 4 words again. She knows the truth. His hands trembled as memories flooded back. The night Margaret died, she'd attempted to tell him something important. Her fever was so high she barely made sense, rambling about secrets and forgiveness. He'd assumed it was delirium from the illness. But what if it wasn't? Ezekiel walked to the window and stared out at the ridge where he'd erected Margaret's headstone. 3 years he'd visited that grave, speaking to the earth about his loneliness, his regrets. his desperate wish for one more conversation. Now he wondered if Margaret had taken secrets with her that someone else knew. A gentle knock at the door made him freeze. In 3 years of isolation, he could count on one hand the number of visitors he'd received. He approached the door cautiously, his hand instinctively moving to the pistol on his hip. Through the window, he saw an elderly woman in a faded dress, her silver hair pulled back severely. She carried a worn leather satchel and looked directly at him with eyes that seemed to see straight through his soul. He opened the door halfway, keeping his body between her and the sleeping baby. The woman smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes.
Mr.
Thorne, she said, I believe you found something that belongs to me. The words struck him like a physical blow. His throat went dry as he stared at the stranger who somehow knew exactly what had happened this morning. I don't know what you're talking about, he managed. She tilted her head, studying him like a hawk studies prey. The baby, Mr. Thorne, and, more importantly, the pendant she's wearing. I've been waiting a very long time to get both back. Ezekiel's grip tightened on the doorframe. How could this woman possibly know about the pendant unless she was the one who'd placed the baby on the tracks? But that raised even more terrifying questions. Who are you? He demanded, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman's smile widened, revealing teeth yellowed by age and secrets. Someone who knew your wife far better than you ever did. Mr. Thorne, Margaret and I had quite a lot to discuss before she died. Behind him, the baby stirred and made a soft sound. The woman's eyes lit up with hunger. Now, she said, taking a step closer, why don't you invite me in? We have so much to talk about. Ezekiel's instincts screamed danger, but his need for answers overrode his caution. He stepped aside, letting the woman enter while keeping his hand near his weapon. She moved through his home like she'd been there before, her eyes taking in every detail with unsettling familiarity. You've changed things since Margaret's time, she said, running her finger along the mantelpiece. She always kept wildflowers here, said they reminded her of her childhood in Missouri. The blood drained from Ezekiel's face. Margaret had never told him about Missouri. In fact, she'd always claimed she was born right here in Colorado Territory. How do you know that? He asked. The woman, who still hadn't given her name, settled into Margaret's old rocking chair as if she belonged there. Margaret told me many things during our long conversations, especially toward the end when the fever made her talkative. You were there when she died. Ezekiel's voice cracked. I never saw you. I was with her every moment. Were you? The woman's eyes glittered with cruel amusement. Every moment. Even when you went to fetch more firewood. Even when you stepped outside to pray for her recovery. Even when you finally collapsed from exhaustion and slept for those few precious hours. Ezekiel's world tilted. He had left Margaret's side briefly, desperately, during those final days. The woodpile had run low, and the cold was killing her, faster than the fever. He'd been gone maybe 20 minutes, racing against time to gather enough fuel to keep her warm. You came into my home while my wife was dying? Because she sent for me. The woman reached into her satchel and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellow with age. She wrote this letter 3 days before she died. Had the preacher's boy deliver it to me. With trembling hands, Ezekiel took the paper. The handwriting was definitely Margaret's, though weaker than usual. His eyes scanned the words, and with each line, his heart sank deeper into his chest. Please come. I'm dying, and there are things I must confess. Things about the baby. Things about why I can never tell Ezekiel the truth. He's a good man, but some truths would destroy him. Come quickly. Time is running out. The letter slipped from his fingers like a dead leaf. Baby, he whispered. What baby? Margaret was never pregnant during our marriage. They'd tried for years, and her inability to conceive had been a source of quiet sorrow between them. Behind him, The infant stirred and made soft, cooing sounds. The woman's face lit up with genuine warmth for the first time since she'd arrived. "There she is," the woman whispered, rising from the chair. "My granddaughter." The word hit Ezekiel like a sledgehammer. Granddaughter. Margaret was my daughter, Mr. Thorne. My daughter who ran away when she was 16 to escape a terrible mistake. My daughter who changed her name and invented a new past to hide from the consequences of what she'd done. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "And that baby, that beautiful child you found this morning, is the daughter Margaret gave birth to 3 months before she married you." Ezekiel staggered backward, his hand finding the wall for support. "That's impossible." "Margaret would have told me? She would never ... wouldn't she?" The woman's voice turned sharp as broken glass. "Margaret spent her entire marriage living a lie, Mr. Thorne, and now that lie has come home to roost." The baby's cries suddenly filled the room, as if she could sense the tension crackling between the adults. But as Ezekiel stared at the woman, claiming to be Margaret's mother, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The woman was reaching into her satchel again. And this time her hand emerged, holding something that gleamed in the firelight. The knife in the woman's hand caught the firelight like a serpent's eye. Ezekiel's throat went dry as she held it casually, almost lovingly, between her weathered fingers. "Easy now," she said, noticing his reaction. "This old thing belonged to Margaret. She carried it everywhere after. Well, after what happened back in Missouri." The woman's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "She used it to protect herself from the father of her child." Ezekiel's hand inched toward his pistol. But the woman shook her head with a sad smile. "I'm not here to hurt you, Mr. Thorne, though I should be angry with you for keeping my granddaughter from me for 3 years." She turned the knife over in her hands, examining the worn handle. "You see, Margaret made me promise something before she died. She made me swear that if anything ever happened to her, I would come for the child she'd hidden away." Hidden away. Ezekiel's mind raced. Margaret never had a child. She died childless. The woman's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Oh, she had a child, all right. Born in a brothel in Kansas City when Margaret was barely 17. The father was a violent man who owned the plaza man who would have killed both Margaret and the baby if he'd known about her pregnancy." The baby's cries intensified, and despite everything, Ezekiel found himself moving toward her. The woman watched him with calculating eyes. "Margaret escaped one night during a thunderstorm," she continued. "Pregnant, terrified, with nothing but the clothes on her back and that pendant around her neck. She made it to a missionary couple who helped unwed mothers. They agreed to take the baby and find her a good home." Ezekiel lifted the infant, and she immediately quieted in his arms. Those gray eyes, so familiar now that he thought about it, stared up at him with complete trust. "The missionary couple were the Weatherbys," the woman said. "Kind people who ran a small ranch near the railroad tracks. They raised Margaret's daughter as their own for 3 years while Margaret reinvented herself and eventually found you. Then why is she here now?" Ezekiel demanded, though part of him already dreaded the answer. "Because the Weatherbys died. Last week, cholera took them both within days of each other." The woman's voice cracked with genuine grief. "Their last act was to put Margaret's pendant around the baby's neck and leave her where they knew she'd be found. They'd heard about the hermit rancher who lived by the tracks, heard about the man who'd lost his wife and blamed himself for her death. The pieces clicked together in Ezekiel's mind like the chambers of a revolver. The baby hadn't been abandoned. Randomly, she'd been left specifically for him to find. But why? He asked. "Margaret visited the Weatherbys exactly once after she married you," the woman continued. "She brought them money and made them promise to never contact her. But she also made them promise something else, so if anything ever happened to them, they should bring her daughter to you." "Why me?" The question came out strangled. The woman's eyes softened for the first time since she'd arrived. Because Margaret saw how desperately you wanted children. She saw how you blamed yourself for her inability to conceive, not knowing it was her own guilt eating her alive. She knew you'd love this child as your own. Ezekiel looked down at the baby in his arms, Margaret's daughter, his wife's secret child, now orphaned and alone in the world. The weight of it pressed down on him like a mountain. "But there's something else you need to know," the woman said, rising from the chair. "Something Margaret made me swear to tell you if this day ever came." She moved closer, the knife still in her hand, and when she spoke again, her words shattered the last of Ezekiel's carefully constructed world. "Margaret didn't die of fever, Mr. Thorne. She was poisoned. And the man who killed her is riding this way right now." The words hit Ezekiel like a physical blow. Poisoned. The room spun around him as 3 years of grief and guilt suddenly took on a sinister new meaning. He'd blamed himself for not saving Margaret, but someone had deliberately taken her life. Who? The word came out as barely a whisper. The woman, who we now realized had never told him her name, moved to the window and peered through the curtains. "His name is Silas Creed. He owned that brothel in Kansas City where Margaret worked. When she escaped, she took something that belonged to him, something worth more than just one pregnant girl." Ezekiel's arms tightened protectively around the baby. "What did she take? Information? Names? Dates? Transactions?" Silas wasn't just running a brothel, he was laundering money for some very dangerous men. Margaret cleaned his office every night, and she was smarter than he gave her credit for. She memorized account numbers, recorded conversations, gathered evidence that could have sent him to the gallows. The baby stirred in his arms, making soft sounds that somehow comforted him even as his world crumbled. Margaret, his quiet, gentle wife, had been living with secrets that could have gotten them both killed. How did he find her? Ezekiel asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. The same way he found everyone who crossed him. Money talks, and Silas had plenty of it. Took him 3 years, but he finally tracked Margaret down. He came to your ranch that winter when you were away checking your cattle. The memory hit him like lightning. 3 days before Margaret got sick, he'd ridden out to check his herd after reports of wolves in the area. He'd been gone overnight, returning to find Margaret strangely quiet and withdrawn. She'd claimed to be feeling poorly, but now he poisoned her slowly, the woman continued, her voice thick with rage. Something that would mimic a fever, make her death look natural. But Margaret was tougher than he expected. She lasted long enough to send for me, long enough to tell me about the evidence she'd hidden, long enough to make me promise to protect her daughter. Where is this evidence? Ezekiel's voice was steadier now, rage replacing shock. Hidden in the one place Silas would never think to look. The woman turned from the window, and her face was pale. Inside the lining of that baby's blanket. Margaret sewed it in there the night before she died, knowing that someday someone would need proof of what Silas had done. Ezekiel looked down at the infant in his arms, seeing her with new eyes. This wasn't just Margaret's daughter, she was carrying the evidence that could bring her mother's killer to justice. "And now he's coming for her," the woman said, her voice barely audible. "I can see the dust cloud on the horizon. 3 riders, moving fast." Ezekiel's blood turned to ice as he followed her gaze through the window. In the distance, 3 dark shapes moved across the prairie like harbingers of death. Silas Creed had finally come to collect what he believed was his. "How long do we have?" he asked, already moving toward his gun cabinet. 20 minutes, maybe less." The woman's hands shook as she examined Margaret's knife. "He's brought help, this time professional killers from the look of them." Ezekiel pulled his rifle from the cabinet and began loading ammunition with practiced efficiency. 3 years of guilt and grief had just transformed into cold, focused fury. Margaret hadn't died of illness, she'd been murdered. And now her killer was coming for her daughter. "What's your name?" he asked the woman as he checked his pistol. "Ruth Caldwell." Margaret's mother. Her voice was steady now, resolved. "I'll be damned if I let that monster hurt my granddaughter." But as Ezekiel prepared for the fight of his life, he couldn't shake the feeling that Ruth was still hiding something about why Silas wanted the baby so desperately and why Margaret's evidence was worth killing for. The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the prairie. And time was running out. The final confrontation, the hoofbeats grew louder, drumming against the earth like an approaching storm. Ezekiel positioned himself at the front window while Ruth moved to the back, both of them flanking the sleeping baby like guardian wolves. Through the glass, Ezekiel could make out the riders clearly now, 3 men in dark coats, their faces shadowed by wide-brimmed hats. The leader rode a massive black stallion and carried himself with the confidence of a man who'd never lost a fight. That had to be Silas Creed. "He looks older than I expected," Ezekiel muttered, studying the man who'd murdered his wife. "Evil." "Age is a man," Ruth replied grimly. "Silas has been collecting debts and blood for 20 years. He won't stop until he gets what he came for." The riders slowed as they approached the ranch house, spreading out in a wide arc to cut off any escape routes. Professional tactics, these weren't just hired guns. They were experienced killers who'd done this before. Silas dismounted first, his movements careful and calculated. Even from a distance, Ezekiel could see the man's pale eyes scanning every window, every possible hiding spot. He called out in a voice that carried easily across the yard. "Ezekiel Thorne, I know you're in there. I'm here to collect something that was stolen from me." Ezekiel stayed silent, his finger resting on the trigger of his rifle. Let Silas make the first move. "I'm not an unreasonable man," Silas continued, walking slowly toward the house. "Your wife took something that belonged to me, and I simply want it back. Hand over the baby and the evidence, and I'll ride away." "You have my word." His word. Ruth spat quietly. The same word he gave to Margaret before he poisoned her. The baby stirred at the sound of voices, her gray eyes opening to stare at the ceiling. Somehow she seemed to sense the danger, remaining perfectly quiet, as if she understood that lives depended on her silence. "I've got all day, Thorne," Silas called out, "but my associates here are getting impatient. They have a tendency to set things on fire when they're bored." As if to emphasize the point, one of the other riders pulled out a burning torch. The message was clear: surrender or watch everything burn. Ezekiel's jaw clenched. This was his home, his land. Margaret was buried just over that ridge, and he'd be damned if he let her killer desecrate her memory by destroying the life they'd built together. "Ruth," he whispered, "can you get to the root cellar with the baby?" "Not without them seeing." "Me? Then we make our stand here." Ezekiel checked his ammunition one more time. 6 shots in the rifle, 6 in his pistol. Against 3 professional killers, it wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. Silas was getting closer now. Close. Enough that Ezekiel could see the cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth. This was a man who enjoyed other people's suffering, who took pleasure in fear and desperation. "Last chance, Thorne," Silas called out. "I know the old woman is in there with your Ruth Caldwell, Margaret's dear mother. Did she tell you how Margaret begged for her life? How she promised to give me everything I wanted if I just let her live long enough to see her husband again?" The words were designed to hurt, to make Ezekiel angry and careless. But instead of rage, he felt something cold and deadly settle in his chest. This man had tortured Margaret before killing her, had made her final moments a living hell. "You made one mistake, Silas," Ezekiel called back, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "And what's that?" "You left me alive." The response was immediate. Silas dove for cover behind a water trough, just as Ezekiel's first shot shattered the morning air. The bullet caught one of the hired guns in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. But as gunfire erupted around the ranch house, Ruth suddenly grabbed Ezekiel's arm with desperate urgency. "There's something else," she hissed over the sound of bullets splintering wood. "Something I didn't tell you about what Margaret stole. It wasn't just evidence about the brothel." "What are you talking about?" Ruth's face was white with terror. Margaret didn't just memorize account numbers, she stole Silas's most valuable asset. The location of a Confederate gold shipment that was never recovered after the war. Gold worth more than $100,000. The world seemed to slow around Ezekiel as the full scope of Margaret's secret revealed itself. She hadn't just been running from a dangerous man, she'd been carrying information that could make someone rich beyond imagination. And now that information was sewn into a baby blanket while 3 killers closed in on their position. The hidden treasure, Confederate gold. The words echoed in Ezekiel's mind as bullets shattered the windows around them. $100,000 worth of stolen treasury, enough to buy armies, enough to kill for without hesitation. "Where?" he demanded, reloading his rifle with practiced speed. "Buried somewhere in the San Juan Mountains," Ruth gasped, pressing herself against the wall as wood splinters exploded near her head. Margaret memorized the exact coordinates from Silas's private papers. She knew it was her insurance policy, the one thing valuable enough to keep her alive if he ever found her. But Silas had found her anyway, and insurance policies meant nothing to a dead woman. The gunfire intensified, forcing Ezekiel to duck as a bullet whinned past his ear. Through the shattered window, he could see Silas directing his men with military precision. They were advancing on the house from 2 sides, using the outbuildings as cover. The baby began to cry, her wails piercing through the chaos like a knife. Ruth immediately scooped her up, holding her close while trying to stay below the window line. "We can't hold them off much longer," she said, her voice tight with fear. Ezekiel knew she was right. His ammunition was running low, and Silas's men were closing the distance. In minutes, they'd be at the door. And then it would be over. But as he watched the killers advance, a desperate plan began to form in his mind, dangerous, probably suicidal, but their only chance. "Ruth, can you ride?" "What?" "My horse is in the barn. If I can create enough distraction, you might be able to make it out the back with the baby." Ruth's eyes widened with understanding and horror. "You're talking about sacrificing yourself?" Margaret would want her daughter to live. Ezekiel's voice was steady, resolved. "Someone needs to make sure Silas pays for what he did." Another volley of gunfire peppered the house, and Ezekiel could hear Silas shouting orders to his men. They were preparing for a final assault. "There's a town called Silverton, 2 days north," he continued, checking his remaining ammunition. "Sheriff, there is an honest man named Jonas Webb. Take the baby, take the evidence, and tell him everything." Ruth clutched the infant tighter, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "There has to be another way." "Maybe there is." Ezekiel's eyes suddenly focused on something outside. "Ruth, how well do you know that knife of Margaret's?" "What do you mean? Is there anything special about it?" "Anything that might be valuable." Ruth frowned, confused by the question. "It's just an old knife. Margaret bought it from a peddler years ago for protection." But as she held it up to examine it more closely, her breath caught in her throat. There, barely visible on the handle, were tiny scratched marks that she'd never noticed before, numbers and letters so small they could have been mistaken for normal wear. "Dear God," she whispered, "these aren't scratches, they're coordinates." Ezekiel's mind raced. Margaret had been even more clever than anyone realized. She hadn't just memorized the location of the Confederate gold, she'd carved it into something she carried every day. something that would never be separated from her. The blanket was a decoy, he breathed. The real treasure map is on that knife. Outside, Silas's voice rose above the gunfire. Burn them out. I want that baby alive, but I don't care about the rest. Flames began to lick at the edges of the roof as one of the hired guns threw his torch. Soon the entire house would be engulfed, forcing them into the open where Silas would be waiting. But now, Ezekiel had leverage. Silas needed the coordinates to find his gold, and those coordinates were literally in their hands. It was time to turn the tables. Silas. Ezekiel called out, his voice carrying over the crackling flames. I know about the gold, and I know you. Need this knife to find it. The gunfire stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, Ezekiel could hear his own heartbeat and the baby's frightened whimpers. The thundering hoofbeats grew closer, and through the smoke-filled air, Ezekiel could see Silas's head snap toward the sound. 5 riders crested the hill, their badges glinting in the morning sun. Sheriff Webb from Silverton, along with a federal marshal and 3 deputies. This is Marshal Hayes. A voice boomed across the prairie. Drop your weapons and surrender. Silas cursed, realizing his carefully planned operation was falling apart. But instead of surrendering, he made a desperate lunge toward the burning house, determined to get what he'd come for before the law could stop him. Ezekiel met him at the front door, and the 2 men collided in a fury of fists and desperation. Silas was older but vicious, fighting with the savagery of a cornered animal. They crashed through the doorframe and rolled across the porch, each man struggling for control. Where are they? Silas snarled, his hands closing around Ezekiel's throat. The coordinates. Tell me. But Ezekiel's rage gave him strength. This man had poisoned Margaret, had made her final days a nightmare of fear and pain. With a roar of fury, he broke free and landed a devastating blow to Silas's jaw, sending the killer sprawling. The lawmen had surrounded the property now, engaging Silas's remaining men in a fierce gunfight. But Ezekiel only had eyes for the man who'd destroyed his world. You want to know where Margaret hid your precious coordinates? Ezekiel gasped, pulling Silas to his feet by his shirt collar. Carved them into that knife you're so desperate to find. But here's the thing, she also carved something else. Silas's eyes widened with desperate hunger. What? A message for the man who killed her. Ezekiel's voice dropped to a deadly whisper. She knew you'd come for them eventually, and she wanted you to know exactly what she thought of you. From inside the burning house, Ruth emerged with the baby and the knife, both precious cargo safe in her arms. The infant was crying but unharmed, and Ruth's face showed grim satisfaction as she handed the weapon to Marshal Hayes. The marshal examined the tiny scratches on the handle, his experienced eyes picking out the hidden coordinates. But there, among the numbers and letters, was indeed a message carved in Margaret's delicate hand. Justice will find you. M.T. Silas saw the words and let out a howl of rage and despair. 3 years of hunting, 3 lives destroyed, and in the end, Margaret had gotten the last word. Silas Creed, Marshal Hayes announced, "You're under arrest for the murder of Margaret Thorne, conspiracy to commit murder, and theft of Confederate assets." As the lawmen led Silas and his surviving associate away in chains, Ezekiel found himself alone with Ruth and the baby. The house was still burning, but everything that truly mattered had been saved. A new beginning. What happens now? Ruth asked, gently rocking the infant who had finally stopped crying. Ezekiel looked down at Margaret's daughter because that's how he would always think of her. Those gray eyes that had seemed so familiar now made perfect sense. They were Margaret's eyes, full of intelligence and quiet strength. "Now she comes home," he said simply. "Margaret wanted me to raise her, and that's exactly what I'm going to do." Ruth smiled through her tears. "And the gold? The government can have it, I've got something more valuable right here. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber, Ezekiel held his daughter for the first time as her true father, not by blood, but by choice, by love, by the promise he'd made to a dying woman who'd trusted him with her most precious secret. Margaret was gone, but her legacy lived on in the child she'd protected, even in death. And Silas Creed would spend the rest of his life paying for the evil he'd done. The baby opened her gray eyes and looked up at Ezekiel with complete trust. In that moment, he knew that Margaret was finally at peace. Her daughter was safe, her killer had been caught, and justice had been served. "Welcome home, little one," he whispered, and for the first time in 3 years, Ezekiel Thorne smiled. The nightmare was over. A new life was just beginning. Thanks for joining us for this incredible tale of justice and redemption. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories from the Old West. Now click on that video on your screen to hear another gripping tale of survival and revenge in the Untamed Frontiera story about Seed. About a woman who disappeared into the desert with her children, only to return years later with skills that would terrify even the most hardened outlaws. Don't miss it. Click now.